Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Christopher Gorham, the author of The Confidante, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America. This is his first book, and he is a teacher of American history at Westford Academy in Massachusetts. Christopher, thanks so much for being here.
Evan, thanks for having me on.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. Every president, every leader needs someone who they can trust. What's really happening? Who will tell me the truth? In short, they need a confidant. Anna Rosenberg was that person to the president who had the most to juggle in American history, whether it was handling domestic legislation or visiting a concentration camp. The Hungarian immigrant was there for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So, Christopher, I looked up her name in the index of two very prominent FDR biographers, and it wasn't there. The name Anna Rosenberg is not there. She was mentioned just 6 times in another very famous FDR biography. So when and how did you realize that we had mostly missed the story of Anna Rosenberg?
Well, Evan, it was a photograph, actually. As you said, I am a high school history teacher here in suburban Boston. And about 6 years ago, I saw a photograph of President Truman, big smile on his face. And he was standing next to a stylishly dressed civilian woman, also had a big smile on her face. And the caption said, Anna Rosenberg, the Assistant Secretary of Defense. And I thought, wow, this photograph from 1950 or 1951, that seems like a really high position in the government to have never heard of this person. So I put the name Anna Rosenberg on my list of topics for my juniors to do their big research paper. And some girls picked her. And then they came to me and they said, Mr. Gorham, we don't have, there's no books on her. We can't find anything on her. So we did a little more digging. And it turns out that her papers had been left to Harvard in 1987. So we don't live too far from there. So my wife and I met these girls down there at the university, at the library. And we looked at the documents. And the librarians, bring out the cart and the crates and the gloves. And one of the students said, Mr. Gorham, come over here. And I went over there, and it was the citation from Truman awarding her the first ever Medal of Freedom. And Evan, it was like handwritten letters from FDR, Eleanor Roosevelt, General Eisenhower, Senator Lyndon Johnson, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Lady Bird Johnson, just on and on, a treasure trove of history. And I thought, I have to write this book.
Yeah. I don't normally bring up an aside this early in a show, but I want to ask you, it occurs to me, what is this experience that you had in discovering this story? Tell us about the educational and the collaborative process in doing history.
Well, I feel like I won the history lottery, first of all. I mean, some academics had written about Anna Rosenberg and written about her very well, but because of their academic pursuits, they were just a chapter here and a chapter there. Like a business historian did one on her mediation as a young woman in New York in the 1920s and 30s. Another historian, a military historian, did something about her time at the Pentagon in 1950, 51, 52. But I felt very fortunate to kind of be free of that academic parameter and able to tell the story as best I could in sort of a narrative history way, where I could go lily pad to lily pad to lily pad and kind of from A to Z tell the story of her entire career.
It's a really well-written book, by the way. The language is really beautiful, and I was definitely captivated by what I read. She came to the United States in 1912. What was the role of women at that time in public life, at least, and private life, I guess? And who were the female role models that a young teenager like her could have looked up to?
When she came to the United States in 1912, it was as the sort of typical immigrant experience so many hundreds of thousands and millions of people experienced. Like you said, Evan, she came from Hungary. She was a prominent family. She was part of a prominent family in Budapest. her father wasn't kicked out by the emperor, but sort of, yeah. And he was ruined financially. He comes to the United States in 1910. He rebuilds his life for 2 years. Then he summons for his family. And, Anna and her sister and mother are sailing under the Statue of Liberty. They're being processed at Ellis Island, and they're being reunited. Just a few years later, she is young Anna Lederer. That was her birth name. Anna Lederer is 17 or 18. She's in the New York Times for the first time as a student leader, and she's meeting the first people that are being very transformative for her. Women who were some of the earliest speakers of Tammany Hall, who were women. A woman named Margaret Fay. She meets a little bit later on. She meets Belle Moskowitz, the de facto chief of staff.
I definitely have a few questions about that period in her life. So
yes,
don't give too much away too early, but go ahead.
So she's a teenager. Her father, in his 2 years in the United States, has become fiercely patriotic. He reciting the Pledge of Allegiance is something that he loves to do. Taking the girls back to look at Statue of Liberty is something he loves to do. The idea of someday becoming a citizen and voting is something that brings tears to his eyes. And young Anna Rosenberg, teenage Anna Lederer, rather, is, she's marching in the streets of New York for women's suffrage, which is right over the horizon. And as the United States enters World War I in 1917, she's doing everything she can for her adopted country. She's selling Liberty bonds, and she and her sister are volunteering as Red Cross nurses. So she was a patriot from day one here in her adopted country.
What would she have seen other women doing with their lives and their careers at this point in American history?
Well, probably she would have seen a lot of women sort of doing domestic chores and housewives and not really engaged in politics. But being the kind of person that she was, even as a youngster, she was seeking out or looking maybe even over the horizon at what was to come for American women. And she was able to see women giving speeches to groups about things like minimum wage for women, giving talks to other women to kind of raise them all up and get them involved in some political issue or another. And so she was probably never cut out to just be a career woman. She was too interested in politics, too interested in getting her voice heard. So she was seeking out women that were unusual for the time, but eager to get that voice heard.
I got to ask, what was life like in New York City in 1917? I'm a New Yorker, but I was born in 83. It's 1983. So things were a little bit different by then. What would it have been like for a young teenager walking the streets and going to school and, observing life around her?
Well, when she first came over, she was made fun of. She and her sister were made fun of for their accent. They were speaking Hungarian and they had a Hungarian accent. They were made fun of for their traditional Hungarian dress that, her mother would have sewn. And, that didn't last too long. Obviously, she could speak English. She and her sister were, Anna became a lifelong fan of dressing well and looking good. So, but when they first arrived, they were in the Bronx and she was going to the public school there. And it was, it was horse carts and elevated trains screeching. It was newspaper boys hawking their wares from the street corners, and just an incredible amount of life and liveliness in New York City on the eve of America's entry into World War I.
My family came to America at around the same time, 1909. They came from Eastern Europe. What were the larger forces driving Eastern European Jews to America at that time?
Well, you had, the worst of all would, of course, be threats of violence or persecution. There was, in terms of, Russian Jews, German Jews were coming over, Jews from the Austro-Hungarian Empire were coming over for, lack of political voice, violence against them in some cases, a lack of future prospects in terms of what they would do for livelihoods. In the case of Anna's father, it was the caprice of an emperor. He provided furnishings literally for imperial palaces, and he spent a lot of money and time on this one job, and he gets to the palace ready to install, and they don't like it. It's either the taste had changed or something about him had gone south, and that's why he wound up leaving Budapest, leaving his family behind, and having to go rebuild his life.
How did her, well, let me ask before I get to this, how did that business failure impact her later political views of those who were down and out?
I think it had a tremendous impact, Evan. She saw when she got to the United States, her father's already patriotic. She sees that even in a small way, even as a teenage girl, you can, if you're aligning yourself with larger forces, you can start to move the needle a little bit. Whether it was women's suffrage, whether it was helping out her country in World War I with selling Liberty bonds. So that was something that was so impactful for her, and was something that she carried with her for her entire life. There was never a moment where Anna Lederer, then Anna Rosenberg, doubted the ability of an informed citizen to make a change, even a small change. But in her case, she made lots of big changes to the political circumstances of the time.
We're talking about her early life here. So I want to ask, how did her early view of the military and of this mobilization that she was witnessing in New York City as Woodrow Wilson begins, of course, later in the war, to take America towards war, how did her early view of all of that impact her future as someone who had to analyze the military for different presidents?
That's a very interesting question. I think she saw it from two angles. One was when she was first in the New York Times, it was as a student leader. The boys' high schools, these massive high schools for boys in New York City, the boys had gone on strike because they were during World War I, because they were supposed to stay at school till 5:00 and do military drills, be ready for, to go into the Army or the Navy. And so if you were a football player or a basketball player, if you were on the chess club, all that was out. You had to do the military drills. So these thousands of boys in New York, high school boys, went on strike. It's the 19 teens, and this is something that you would do. And remarkably, as their voice, they pick this young leader from one of the girls' schools, Wadley School for Girls, named Anna Lederer, and she becomes the voice for these boys. And lo and behold, she mediates an arrangement. She mediates her first mediation between the city of New York and these two high schools. And the strike was ended. The school day was not lengthened quite as long, and she had found her voice.
Were you able to find a trait that she was born with that led her to being such an outward person?
No, I think hardworking, almost superhuman capacity for hard work is the trait that I think I most see in her. She, as a girl, thought of herself, when she dreamed about what she wanted to become, it was a scientific gardener. She loved plants. She loved flowers. Maybe it was a memory of their pretty well-off circumstances in Budapest, where there's lots of flower markets and stuff like that. But that starts to change, I think, around the same time that we're talking. She sees the country go off to war, and then she, in fact, meets a soldier. And in 1919, she marries Mike Rosenberg, who's a veteran of World War I.
Yeah, so my next question was going to be, she is a 1910s version of an online dater. They had a correspondence.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. There'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
You're exactly right, Evan. Part of what Anna and her sister did during World War I was to write these sort of hero letters to the men to keep the soldiers overseas company, and that's how she met this young guy Mike Rosenberg, who lived not far from her. So when he comes back from overseas, they met face to face, and I think there was some pressure on her to start her life separate from her parents. So she maybe rushed into marriage a little bit, but they got married, and she saw what it was like to live with a veteran and live with someone who'd seen the trenches and seen the horrors of World War I.
All right. So politically here, I mean, she starts to navigate. There's a quote when, I'm telling an aside here, but George W. Bush, when he was welcoming the Clintons back to the White House, he, of course, was complimentary to the Clintons, even though they'd been, of course, bitter rivals. And he said, if you can survive in politics in New York, that's impressive, talking about Hillary, because that's a rough business. Anna Rosenberg was in it when it was a really, really rough business, and it was controlled by one group, by one guy. How did she find her way into Tammany Hall, and how did she start navigating these very oppressive hallways, even for probably people who are really well connected to begin with?
So she's 18. It's 1918, 1919. She's finished with high school. She's married to Mike, and she is very, very keen to see women get the right to vote. We're right there. They're going to get the right to vote in 1920, but it's right there. It's happening. These marches of tens of thousands of women in New York are marching the streets up and down Broadway for this, and she's part of that. She goes to see her district Tammany Hall speaker on this very issue of women's suffrage, and it's a bare-knuckled old guy named Jim Hagan, and he's up at the front railing against women's right to vote. And Anna from the back, she and her friends had to walk around the spittoons, that's old school New York, and wave away the cigar smoke. And Anna from the back of the room stands up and gives this guy a bunch of sass. And instead of being angry with her, Evan, he takes her under his wing, and Jim Hagan, becomes a mentor to young Anna Rosenberg and teaches her the retail politics of New York City, how to hit the pavement, how to make dozens, hundreds, thousands of phone calls, how to, twist people's arms and get your issue acted upon. So that was tremendously transformative for her.
I love that she loves the phone too, because I'm a phone guy. So I love that she works the phones. What was the reaction of men in Tammany Hall and other people she was reaching out to about a woman being involved in politics at A, her young age, and B, at the time in America that it was?
I think she was described by a high school friend as a Roman candle darting into space. I mean, I think she was just like a meteorite. She became it wasn't just Jim Hagan that she met, but she also met Belle Moskowitz, who, as I said just a second ago, she was sort of the de facto chief of staff of the governor of New York. And the older Belle Moskowitz showed Anna something very interesting, how to exercise power behind the scenes. Belle Moskowitz was drafting legislation. She was writing speeches. She was fundraising. And Al Smith was a potential presidential candidate. So this was a big, powerful guy. And a lot of what he was doing and what he was being taken care of behind the scenes by Belle Moskowitz. And Anna sees that. So she not only sees how to get things done the retail way, the phone, the telephone, the knocking on doors, but she also understands that at that time in history, at least, the way to get things done if you're a woman sometimes is to be behind the curtain. And I think that's just it shows her depth of reading how the time was and reading the city that she lived in, because she was able to do both of those things.
I love the name Belle Moskowitz. It's a phenomenal New York City political name, but Of course, her story is very well intertwined, not only with Alfred E. Alfred E. Smith, but with Robert Moses,
Yes,
who
yes.
was the Alfred E. Smith is, of course, the only person who Robert Moses would call by their title. It was the only person he dignified with calling him governor, as we learned from the Robert Caro books. Did Robert Moses and Anna Rosenberg ever have a run-in? And I'm embarrassed. I should have looked at my Power Broker copy before I started this. But does Robert Moses ever meet Anna Rosenberg?
I didn't come across evidence that they had met, but Tammany Hall was, as you know, had sort of an outreach to immigrants, because they saw it can't just be, these cigar chomping Irish guys, because we have, literally hundreds of thousands, millions of immigrants coming into the city. We wanted them into the fold. So there was people like Herbert Lehman, who became the governor of New York. And I think congressman, I think senator too. He's a senator, U.S. senator. And Anna Rosenberg. There was a woman named Anna Cross, who became a judge in the judicial system of New York City. So Robert Moses, I didn't come across, but Herbert Lehman and Anna Rosenberg and Fiorello LaGuardia were all growing up in that sort of immigrant outreach part of Tammany Hall at the same time, and they were all. Anna was very, very fond of Fiorello LaGuardia and vice versa, and also very, very friendly with Herbert Lehman for essentially their entire careers.
How many documents did you find, by the way? How much personal correspondence is there in that trove at Harvard?
Well, she did not leave. What Robert Caro had to go through for LBJ is,
and still going through. Yeah,
right. This was not tremendously voluminous. Half a dozen boxes, microfilm, great correspondence between her, Anna Rosenberg, and Eleanor Roosevelt. And then what you do is, what I did was started to cross-reference that with Bernard Baruch, with somebody that was a mentor to her, a name some of your listeners will recognize. People in the Roosevelt sphere, like Frances Perkins, cross-reference her stuff. So it was not only Anna Rosenberg's papers, but cross-referencing stuff from Ann Arbor to Yale, and that allowed me to put the story together.
So she's got many connections with many, many big names here. You've already listed half a dozen of them, but believe it or not, there's a bigger name on the horizon, if you can believe it, when you think about the likes of Alfred E. Smith and Tammany Hall and Herbert Lehman. FDR is waiting in the wings. How did she catch the eye of the future president?
So she's 28 years old. She has, at Bell Moskowitz's suggestion, she started a public relations and labor relations company, or office. She is a young mother. In 1920, she and Mike had a son, Thomas. And she calls herself a housewife dabbling in politics. But dabbling in politics is what she does. She's on this parallel track of being a career woman and also being interested in politics. And in 1928, she attends a Democratic meeting Democratic Women event hosted by Eleanor Roosevelt at a hotel in New York City. And Eleanor Roosevelt meets her and says, "Young lady, what do you do?" And Anna says, "Well, I have a labor relations office and do some mediation." And Eleanor says, "Well, my husband is running for governor of New York, and he could use someone like you on his team." So at age 28, she finds herself on the Roosevelt governorship team with people like Louis Howe, Jim Farley, and Frances Perkins. And they had a sprint of a campaign, and they also had a long shot candidate, but they got him in. He won the 1928 governor's election.
Was FDR immediately taken by her ability?
I think I was at the FDR library last week, and records are pretty scant when you go back to that gubernatorial race. But reading between the lines, Evan, I think the answer is yes. And part of the evidence is when he takes what he's cooking up in New York during the Great Depression, national, in the New Deal, he's bringing her along. So I think the evidence is there that even as a young aide in the governor's race, she had something that he recognized. And, by 1933-34, he's bringing her onto the national stage.
What made her the perfect New Dealer?
She was, for a person like Roosevelt, she was she ticked off all the boxes. He liked in many of his aides this sort of for them to sort of be unattached in a way, to be almost bachelors. Harry Hopkins was like that. Tommy Corcoran was like that for a while. Some of his favorites, Missy LeHand, of course, was like that for many, many years.
And for several reasons.
For several reasons, right?
Not to make a crude joke, but yeah.
In Anna Rosenberg's case, she was able to go between New York and Washington as if she was unattached. She was a tremendous listener. Roosevelt was a raconteur, as you know, loved to tell stories. She loved to listen to them, and she would laugh, and he would feel good about that. She was a witty person. She could tell her own stories. And, he enjoyed that. They could gossip about things, but also they could get things done. And it was just kind of she had a lot of things that Roosevelt really prized in his advisors.
But they became, I mean, personal friends. I mean, this was not someone he was sending around to, pick up this and pick up that and, make this call for me. I mean, he leaned on her for personal support, which I just thought was fascinating.
That's right. Just to clarify sort of where things are. So he's governor of New York in 1928, the Great Depression, 1929. Roosevelt concocts this a very energetic response to the suffering in New York, and he becomes a leading candidate for president. He's elected in 32, and he scales all that up for the nation. It's the New Deal. In 35, he has Anna Rosenberg, the only woman regional director. The country, for these big, massive New Deal programs that were being rolled out, the country was divided into 12 regions. And Anna Rosenberg was the only woman regional director she was in control of New York State, including New York City. And she does that throughout the middle 1930s. And then in 1938, in addition to her being the regional director of Social Security, Roosevelt sends her along with a group of other people, to Europe to study labor relations in Britain and Sweden. And when she came back, I think that's the point at which Roosevelt really knew he had someone who was, whatever he was going to do in politics in the presidency thereafter, he wanted to have her close by.
And you look at the caliber of people who were running programs for FDR. I mean, one of them was Lyndon Johnson. I mean, this was not, softball these guys were playing. I mean, this was hardball, and he had people who could handle a massive workload to literally get the country back on proper economic footing. And she was one of those people.
You're absolutely right. Like with Social Security, Evan, you have people like Francis Perkins, and before that, Dr. Townsend, and all these administrators are conjuring up the Social Security program, which is going to transform America. And then you give it to, and
still is, by the way. I mean, we're 80 years later, it still is.
Absolutely. And even more, and it makes the story even more remarkable. Then you give this program that you've conjured up in Washington, you give it to Anna Rosenberg, New York State, including the most populous city in the country, New York City. And it's her responsibility to sign up the people of New York State, which is Roosevelt's home state. So 6 million New Yorkers signed up to Social Security. She had hundreds of people under her. She had multitudes of field offices. And yet she still had, older women saying to her, Mrs. Rosenberg, I don't want to give you my real age because my husband will find out. And she would say, darling, she would say, Uncle Sam and I are going to keep your secrets. She would have couples come in tears. How can you help us keep our apartment? And she would make, however many phone calls it needed to take and get that couple sorted out. So she's doing this massive street level rolling out of Social Security, millions and millions of people, but also has the empathetic touch at the personal level.
How have so many authors missed this incredible story?
Such a great question. I have suspicions as to why. Very few, as you mentioned at the top of your show, very, very few well-known histories. Doris Kearns Goodwin's No Ordinary Time actually gives Anna a couple of pages.
She's in there 6 times. That's the book I mentioned. Yeah.
And David McCullough's Big Truman bio, she's in there a bit. But the majority of these 1940s, 1950s biographies, she's completely absent. I it certainly didn't help that she shared a surname with the people who were picked up in 1950
Right.
for atomic spying. And Anna Rosenberg, throughout her life in Washington, she was a famous woman. I mean, I think your listeners, I should be clear on that. She was in not only the New York Times from 1917 to 1983, but profiled in the New Yorker in 1938 when she was a 38-year-old woman. She had this profile in the New Yorker. She was, by 1942, she's in Vogue. She's in Time. She's in the Saturday Evening Post. She's, going to have a photo essay in Life later on.
So people noticed her at the time, but the
Yes.
the generations after didn't.
At the time, she was, in fact, one of her contemporaries literally said she was a famous person in her day. Eleanor Roosevelt said, I have a biographer I want you to talk to. Anna Rosenberg says, no, I'm not interested. Edward R. Murrow says, Anna, you have quite a book to write someday. Anna says, I'm not interested. It was her natural disinclination to trumpet herself. She loved when the journalists visited. She loved, when they took photographs of her, but it was always about the commander-in-chief. It was always about the issue that she was working on. It was always about, sometimes, to give credit to her underlings at these massive offices where she was working. Never about her. And then in 1950, when she's at the apex of her career, when she pivots to the Pentagon, it's literally the same year that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are arrested by the FBI. So this natural disinclination to not trumpet her own career, she doubles down. She even says, I like to solve problems for these men, and then I'm happy to just fade out of the picture. So that's a huge part of why she just went poof at some point and wasn't in the histories of that era.
She never considered running for office or anything like that. She was a behind the scenes person, or maybe she did.
She was approached so many times for that. There was literally, she would appear at top polls for mayor, who should be the next mayor of New York City. Her name was floated for ambassadorship to Moscow. She was floated for Congress, for Senate, not interested. She had, when she wasn't in Washington, she was back in New York, back at her desk, working on public relations, working on labor relations, and making a life for her and her family, but not interested in the elected office. She just wasn't.
Your book opens with an incredible scene at the end of World War II. Explain why she was sent to Europe. And I'm also curious as to how her European roots helped her understand World War II.
So this remarkable story, she is a New Deal officer in FDR's army all through the 1930s. In 1941, she becomes very, very close to Roosevelt. People like Missy LeHand are out of the picture. Tommy Corcoran's out of the picture. She gets her seat at the Roosevelt Round Table. And that really continues throughout World War II. In 1944, President Roosevelt, who himself had been sent by President Wilson to World War I in 1917 18, he can't, it's not a time for him to travel. He's obviously has he's wheelchair bound. He's not going to do that. So he sends Anna Rosenberg as his personal emissary to the battle zones of Europe. And she arrives in France just weeks after D-Day and is embedded with the troops before they were even broken out into the open ground. And then, she's racing through France with Patton's army, and as they cross occupied France, and she sees all the things that the men would have seen, dead enemy, dead Americans, widows, orphans, ruined villages. And, she was not there as a VIP. She was there as, someone who was going to sleep on the cold ground and eat rations off the hood of a Jeep and listen to these men. That was her mission. Find out what these men wanted from their country, should they be lucky enough to return. And what she found was surprising to her, and indeed surprising to President Roosevelt. They didn't want to learn how to operate a new machine when they got home. They didn't even necessarily want a job. They wanted an education, a college education, an opportunity to better themselves through higher education. And that gave really the educational thrust to what we know as the GI Bill.
Yeah, and she helped run part of that too, didn't she?
Yes, very, very interested in Veterans Affairs, and because, Evan, she knew the men who returned were going to be different people than the ones who left. And she'd been married to a World War I veteran. Her son was in World War II. She had seen the horrors of war, not only on the battlefield, but in 1945, when she made her second trip at Roosevelt's behest, she was one of the first Allied women to see a liberated concentration camp. And the survivors were still walking around. She said few could stand erect. She said these women approached her. Anna was wearing a WAC uniform. She always carried a woman's handbag and a man's briefcase. And she climbs out of the Jeep, and, women still in the striped uniforms can hardly stand are approaching her. And she reaches into her bag. What can I give them? I don't have clothes. I don't have food, but lipsticks, pencils, notepads. And she felt, on the one hand, the insufficiency of that gesture, but also she could see in the look on their faces that she was giving back some of their small piece of their humanity back to them. So very profound moment for her, but she had seen all the terrible things of war.
What did she make of getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the first Presidential Medal of Freedom? What an honor, right?
Well, I just love that picture. It's in the book. She is just beaming with pride and joy as the medal is pinned on her. The Medal of Freedom was established in the aftermath of World War II to recognize civilians that had helped defeat the enemy. And Anna Rosenberg was the first American man or woman to be awarded that commendation. And it was a moment of just glorious pride for her. And you can see it in her face, for Eisenhower to put her up for the medal, for Truman to also put her up for the medal, and for it to be pinned on her that day was quite an accomplishment.
I really wish that my copy of the book, I'm not doing a hint here, but my copy of the book doesn't, I have an advanced copy. So
ARC, we'll take care of that, Evan.
There you go. In 1950, she winds up in the bullseye of Joe McCarthy, and she acknowledges that her name and her religion and who she had worked for was all going to start to work against her and put her in the crosshairs of this enormous investigation that begins to take place.
Yes. So her experience, not only dealing with millions of people in Social Security, and then she also dealt with what was then called manpower, but we would call it personnel during World War II, where she met General Marshall for the first time. She is essentially retired from government after World War II. After she gets the Medal of Freedom, she goes back to New York. She rebuilds her business. She buys her apartment after renting for many, many decades. Her son is working with her at the public relations firm. Everything is pretty good. And then she opens a letter in 1950 from General George C. Marshall, who is now the Secretary of Defense. And the letter says, "Dear Anna, I hope you can find a way to come down to Washington, to the Pentagon, and be my number 2 and help me rebuild the size and strength of the U.S. Army. And we're trying to occupy Germany, Japan. We're trying to hem in the Soviets to Eastern Europe. And now we have this disastrous war in Korea. I need your help." And like you said, she said, well, General Marshall and President Truman, I have all of these negatives. I'm the perfect target for McCarthyites, for people on that side of the spectrum. Jewish, I'm an immigrant, I speak with an accent, I'm a New Dealer, I'm a woman, I'm a civilian, lots of reasons why I should not be the number 2 at the Pentagon. And to her credit, she says this, to their credit, to the credit of Truman and General Marshall, they say, no, Marshall wants you. So she goes down, the Senate Armed Services Committee unanimously approves her nomination, and all that is left is the full Senate vote. And it's at this point where Senator McCarthy, who is not on the Senate Armed Services Committee, gets wind of this, and he pulls some strings in the Senate and delays the full Senate vote. And that buys him time to conjure up a smear campaign trying to paint Anna Rosenberg as a secret communist.
And that just, of course, couldn't be further from the truth, given her patriotism and all that.
Absolutely. In fact, one piece of evidence in her defense was to hold up the New York City phone book and say, do you know how many Anna Rosenbergs are in here? You have a guy in New York that said he met Anna Rosenberg at a communist cell meeting in 1930, whatever. There are 47 Anna Rosenbergs. How can he be sure that it was me? And sure enough, the communist Anna Rosenberg was found living out in California. This Anna Rosenberg, a lifelong patriot, lifelong anti-communist.
Boy, I'd be in trouble. How many Evan Axelbanks are in the phone book, right? All right. before we sort of start to wrap this up, I want to ask JFK. She helps him arrange what became a very famous party, even by JFK standards.
Yes, yes.
Explain how Marilyn Monroe and Happy Birthday, Mr. President, I guess in some ways is a tribute to the organizational abilities of Anna Rosenberg.
Sure. Of all the presidents that she dealt with, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and Johnson, all of those presidents relied on Anna Rosenberg, liked Anna Rosenberg, sought her counsel, used her data and counsel to shape policy. The one president who didn't was John F. Kennedy. Eleanor Roosevelt said to Kennedy, she would be perfect for your cabinet. And other people around Kennedy were saying the same thing, but it was not to be. Kennedy saw Anna Rosenberg as a fundraiser. And she was, as a loyal Democrat, as a loyal American, she raised funds for Kennedy. And most famously, she was the co-host of the 1962 birthday gala that was held at Madison Square Garden. And as co-host, she put together the entertainment list. So she wrote letters to Ella Fitzgerald, to Danny Kaye, to this ballet troupe, to Marilyn Monroe, and signed them all up. And when you look at the footage again, you'll notice the black and white footage of Marilyn Monroe singing Happy Birthday. The woman sitting right next to John F. Kennedy all night is Anna Rosenberg.
What a seat to the party, I'll tell you that. Did she overhear what JFK said about the rear end of Marilyn Monroe, which has made it into that quote has made it into the books, by the way.
She could use some salty language or blue language didn't turn her off, but yes, I hope she didn't hear that from the President of the United States.
No kidding. All right. What does the story of Anna Rosenberg tell us about the need to value public service in our country?
Oh, I think it's a manual. I think it's a how-to manual, Evan. She never went into a meeting without data, without having done the homework. Being a citizen is hard work. It is you need to inform yourself with facts, not with ideas. They have to be factual ideas, and it takes tremendous energy at the citizen level to move the needle politically. But if whether it's housing equity, whether it's reforms to the prison system or anything that, it can be men, it can be women, it can be anybody. This is a how-to manual for how to be an engaged citizen. Now, obviously, not everyone is going to run into FDR, but even still, before she met FDR, she was doing everything in her power to make a difference in her adopted city, in her adopted country, and she was gaining some success. So I think it's an inspirational story of how Citizen Rosenberg can be an inspiration for all of us who want to make our country that we love the greatest it can be and the most equitable it can be. What
do you hope young women notice about the life of Anna Rosenberg? What did your students notice about it?
Well, I think they are able to, contemporary women today are able to make the connection pretty easily between, Condoleezza Rice or Madeleine Albright or, the governor of New York or Governor Whitmer of Michigan. So many women in government now and in positions of, Supreme Court, for instance, positions of decision-making power. They can make the link between those contemporary women back to Anna Rosenberg. But there was a time after, about the time you were being born, 1983, there was sort of a gap when the Frances Perkins, Eleanor Roosevelt, Anna Rosenberg were off the stage. And then there was like this long gap before women re-entered the arena in great numbers. And that dismayed Anna Rosenberg tremendously at the end of her life. But, were she alive today, she would see these very active numbers of women in federal and state governments. And I think she'd be very heartened by that. And I hope today's women are also heartened by that.
I'd never heard of the Westford Academy until I looked up your bio in preparation for this episode. Tell us about the school where you work.
Well, Evan,
it was a really interesting history.
It sounds very fancy, Westford Academy, but I do want to tell everybody it's just it's the public school in the town of Westford, Massachusetts, which is It's out by Lexington and Concord, if you know that, not far from the great city of Lowell. And it is one of the oldest coeducational high schools in the country. It opened up in 1792, and I'm very proud of that, coeducational. And one of the first students was Paul Revere's son. So you had Paul Revere's son, and you had, one of a young girl in 1792 or 1800. So a lot to be proud of. The building, the original school still stands. It's the Westford Museum, History Museum. And I was fortunate enough to speak there a couple of weeks ago. Really had a nice event.
What did your students say? What do they say about the fact that you've written a book? That's got to be cool for them.
They, over the couple of years of writing and research, got a lot of Anna Rosenberg stories. So
too many.
They can kind of tell when I'm winding up, because I'll kind of say something like, "You're never going to believe." Even today, Evan, we started talking about the Great Society and the President Johnson years. And to start off the unit, I had to play a little audio clip of a phone call that Anna Rosenberg made to LBJ only days after he'd become president in the tragic circumstances of Kennedy's assassination. And she calls, she's very matter of fact. They've known each other since 1937. It's a short phone call, just a couple minutes long, but she's setting up a meeting with the new president. She says, "You're doing a very good job. Things are off to a great start. Thank you, darling. Thank you, darling," he says. And when that meeting took place, just a couple weeks after that, this is early in Johnson's presidency, it was, "Johnson, you have to get more women in the federal government." And he did.
How is it different teaching high school students versus college students? Most of the professors we have here are university and college teachers. How do you view your job as a high school teacher these days?
Well, I've been, I think, very fortunate, because if you're at the college level, there's pressure to write for a certain audience in a certain way. And I just don't have that pressure. I was able to write, like I said, I was able to write not an academic article or academic piece about this woman, Anna Rosenberg. I was able to write sort of a narrative history. And, in a way, obviously COVID was sort of in between, but, in my writing, on the weekends and on Saturday morning early and so forth, I was able to still maintain my teaching obligations. But I feel very fortunate it's a sort of strange position to be a high school history teacher with a book out, but a history book out, but not having, sort of the college requirements on you for tenure and publishing allowed me the freedom, I think, to do that. So very, very fortunate, both as a teacher in the classroom. And I'll tell you what, I could not have written this book without the storytelling chops that came from energizing 17-year-olds every day at 7:35 in the morning.
That's tough. Do you think you'll write another book? Do you think there's another one in you? Do you have an idea yet? Do you know what you're doing or no?
I do. The proposal when you do nonfiction, of course, you do a proposal, not the whole manuscript. But I'm very fascinated with the time in the artist Henri Matisse's life where his children and his muse were sort of fleeing the Nazis, going down to the south of France, and trying to make a life where there was still artistic inspiration during the occupation, during World War II. So the sort of the life of Matisse and his family during the occupation is something that I'm very interested in putting a proposal together.
Nice. Wrap up the life of Anna Rosenberg for us. Where is she buried? And what would be a good monument to her if there could be one built somewhere, and where would it be?
She's buried in New York. I don't exactly know the exact location, so I can't tell you that. But monument, I've you think about Frances Perkins with the Frances Perkins home up in Maine. I don't know. She was a lifelong New Yorker. A monument would have to be, even though she spent a lot of time in Washington, a monument would have to be somewhere in New York. In fact, when you drive along Park Avenue or Madison Avenue and you see all those flowers in the middle of the avenue, that was her. That was the beautification efforts that she and Lady Bird did in the 60s and even into the 70s. So she loved flowers. She loved New York. maybe there could be an Anna Rosenberg Center somewhere in the city that combined, had a nice big lobby with some beautiful roses, her favorite flower, and a place where people could, a 3-dimensional location where people could go and see the life and career of this remarkable woman, this remarkable American.
Christopher Gorham, or Mr. Gorham to his students, the author of The Confidant, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America. Thanks so much for being here.
Evan, thanks for having me on.
Check out the book. Check out his website, which is ChristopherCGorham.com. He's on Twitter at @CCGorham. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.